Boa tarde. Todos bem? Espero que sim. Vamos ver se o Rick já está por aí. Sim, sim. Bom, mais um encontro do Tiaços. Queria agradecer novamente a vocês pela presença. Hoje, recebendo um queridíssimo convidado, uma oportunidade absolutamente rara para o público brasileiro, e fico feliz do Tiaços estar podendo oferecer isso para todos nós da comunidade junguiana, astrológica, filosófica, psicológica, receber conosco o queridíssimo Richard Tarnas. Seja bem-vindo, Richard. Vou fazer a apresentação formal primeiro. Richard é professor de Psicologia e História Cultural no Instituto de Estudos Integrais da Califórnia, em São Francisco, onde ele fundou o programa de pós-graduação em Filosofia, Cosmologia e Consciência. Frequentemente dá aulas sobre estudos arquetípicos e psicologia profunda na Pacifica Graduate, em Santa Bárbara, e foi diretor de programa e educação do Esalen Institute em Big Sur, Califórnia. Ele é o autor do livro A Epopeia do Pensamento Ocidental, que a gente tem em português, e também Cosmos e Psique, uma história de visão do mundo ocidental desde o grego antigo até o pós-moderno. Esse livro, Cosmos e Psique, recebeu o prêmio de livro do ano da Scientific and Medical Network e é a base para a próxima série documental The Changing of the Gods. Rick também é ex-presidente da International Transpessoal Association e faz parte do Board of Governors do Instituto C.G. Jung de São Francisco. Rick, um prazer imenso tê-lo conosco. É uma grande alegria poder te ouvir, ter você perto da gente. Espero que a gente possa ter, como eu te falei antes, uma bela festa com as suas palavras. Sinta-se à vontade. Obrigado pela tua presença.
Thank you, Marcus. Can you hear me okay? Yes. And lighting is okay. The view is okay. So thank you. I am honored to be invited to be with you today. I have a special feeling for Brazil. Partly it comes from Brazilian friends that I've had over the years, just a few, and now perhaps I have a few more friends that I'm glad to be with. And I also feel there's a certain sense of, let me just get my my notes here, which I carefully put together. Excuse me one moment. This is an example of the trickster who suddenly eludes one with the carefully prepared outline of what I was about to say. So I will take a few minutes just to wing it, as we say in English. My feeling is that I've been to Brazil 2 times in my life, and they both times made a very deep impression on me. And the first time was in 1996 when I came to Manaus, Brazil, for a conference of the International Transpersonal Association. There was about 1,000 people there, probably more, and from all over the world, psychologists, spiritual leaders, shamans, and musicians, dancers, etc. And it was a very special gathering. And then another time I came to speak in Florianopolis in 2007. And that was also very meaningful. It's a place where research is done on ayahuasca, the use of visionary plants, sacred medicines. And I came to lecture there for a week or so. But I also feel that Brazil and the United States have a special connection in certain ways. And that is both of, we are of course the two most populous countries in the Western Hemisphere. And these vast lands with so many people in them. And we have a very outsized influence on the ecology of the planet. In certain ways, both Brazil and the United States will influence the fate of the world in very powerful ways, as much as any other countries in the world. Each in their own ways are having a very powerful influence on the state of Gaia, of the planetary biosphere that we all live in and breathe in. When I was in between the two times that I came to Brazil, I had participated in a conference, perhaps some of you were there, that James Hillman was part of in Santa Barbara, California, in the year 2000, right as the new millennium was beginning. The conference was called Psychology at the Threshold, you know, at the beginning of the new 1,000-year period. And what did that mean for psychology? Where were we going? And a Brazilian archetypal psychologist, Gustavo Barcelos, came to give a lecture there. And I remember it very well. It also had an influence on me, because he talked about how, you know, how James Hillman would always wish to have he said psychology needs to go south. It has to go south. And what he meant was it has to go south of the Alps in Europe. It has to go from basically the Germanic lands of Protestant Christianity, of science and spirit and mind, and it has to go south to the Mediterranean, to the world of soul, to the world of sensuous, lived, embodied, and souled life. And Gustavo Barcelos came and said to us all, we really need to go south. You really need to go south, all the way to Brazil, to the deep south, where there are, and I'm paraphrasing now. This is more my memory 20 years later, 21 years later. But he said something like, we need to open ourselves in the north. The Northern archetypal psychology community needs to, in a sense, take in the great sources of vision of soul that are nurtured in the land and people of Brazil, because Brazil is a place where 3 continents of peoples come together. from indigenous or Native Americans, Europeans, and Africans, and that these different races and continents are mingling together, and there is also a blending of monotheism and polytheism that is very important for us to take in. I can remember myself just being very struck by the ways in which certain religious communities in Brazil, the União Vegetal and another church there, where there is a kind of interplay of both profound roots in shamanic use of ayahuasca in sacred ritual, and at the same time an interplay blending with genuine Christian imagery and experience and ritual in a quite authentic and creative way. And so I knew what he was talking about in that respect. I also very much so my sense is that there's this both need, a kind of compensatory need for the U.S. and for the northern part of the world to, in a sense, become more conscious of its unconscious, and some of its unconscious resides in the South. Some of its soul, some of its anima mundi. Depth psychology has a certain, I think, special insight. Well, let me mention one other harder, more difficult part of the kinship between the U.S. and Brazil, and that is the fact that both of our countries have had to undergo a very challenging political situation in recent years, with watching the government be overtaken by a certain shadow of our country, I think, of our countries. Certainly, speaking for my own country, just the authoritarian leadership of in the United States with Donald Trump, just representing, in a sense, the darkest shadows of our country, also of white people, also of wealth, of maleness, patriarchy, and I very much embrace the idea that comes out of the field of psychohistory, that when dictators or authoritarian leaders, demagogues, rise to power in a country, it doesn't just reflect the fact that they are a very powerful person or leader. Rather, as Lloyd Demouse put it, he's an historian who uses psychology in his analyses, and he's worked with Stanislav Grof. And he said, really, such leaders are more like garbage collectors, in the sense that they they take in all the shadow of the country and articulate it. They pick up and then feed it back. So I feel a certain poignant kinship between our countries in that respect as well. when I was growing up, coming of age, the great urge was for a coming together of East and West, where Western civilization would open up to the wisdom, the deep mystical wisdom of Asian traditions, of Buddhism, of Hinduism, of Taoism, and take in the great treasures that India and China and Japan and so forth, Tibet would have to give us. And of course, I still think that's very true. But gradually, this is going back to the 1960s, even the 50s, and then the 60s, very strong, 70s. But then there started to become an awareness in the circles that I live in that at least as important, perhaps more important at this time in our evolution, there has to be a dialogue between North and South. And I think in many ways, this dialogue is just beginning. This integration of the whole. Isa, when I say whole, it's WHOLE, not whole, HOLE. The larger unity that we need to take that in and bring the North and South into a great, and particularly to make the North more conscious of how much its journey has been absolutely dependent upon and intermixed with the journey of the South, and that in many ways there is a shadow that the North has cast on the South that has to be now assimilated. Okay, so one moment while I pull in this elusive notes here. Thank you for your patience, but I appreciate Marcus's comment to consider this to be a relaxed party, a social symposium of the old days. So it's quite striking. Voila. You know, this Marcus and Luciana, do you know who, you probably know Gustavo Barcelos or know of his work? Yes. So one of the reasons that I could relate to the importance of what he was saying is that in my own life, there has been a similar commingling of different cultural influences that, you know, there's something in us as human beings that seeks to take the diverse parts of who we are and our diverse ancestral traditions and the different cultural influences, the places we live, the different learning communities that we are part of in the course of our lives, and we seek to integrate these. You could say, looking at your horoscope or your natal chart, you have all these different planets, these different archetypal powers, as it were, that pull us in different directions, and they each have their own character, their own personality, so that we're all multiple, we're all plural, and yet it's one chart, it's one horoscope, it's one person that we need to bring together. And I know much of my life that's articulated, for example, in The Passion of the Western Mind, which Marcus showed you the book cover of, is an attempt to bring together these different influences and different cultural impact on my life. For example, I was born in Switzerland, in Geneva, Switzerland, but I grew up in the United States with American parents. On the one hand, I had a Catholic upbringing, childhood, educated by Jesuits, like our current Pope Francis, and at the same time was living in the world of the 1960s and 70s, the bursting in of the psychedelic revolution. I went to Harvard University for my education in the later 1960s, 1968, 69, 70, 72, and was taking in the whole longer Western tradition, but taking in Eastern thought, taking in the psychedelic revolution, then coming to California and living here now for almost half a century. The Esalen Institute, where I lived and worked for over a decade, and where I met some Brazilian friends like Neusa, who I think is here on our call here, and so I too, like Brazil, have all these different impulses coming through, and of course, yeah, the power of nature here is very strong in California. I think depth psychology shines a very special light on these connections that I've been drawing out between our lands and what Gustavo was calling for. When I think of Brazil, I think of the United States, I think of the state of the world, and I think of the state of depth psychology today. I'm not sure if you use the term depth psychology in Brazil, but particularly it's that form of psychology that has a depth dimension that is not that delves into the deep unconscious. That well, as Hillman would say, all psychology has to be depth psychology, or it's not really psychology. All psychology has to be about soul, or it's not psychology, since psyche means soul. And he said, if it's not about soul, then we should better call the psychology that is practiced in the academic world, the universities, we should call it statistics or animal breeding or physical anthropology or cultural journalism. But really true psychology has to be about the soul. And when I think of the state of the world today, and I think about the deeper meaning of psyche, psyche in Greek, anima in Latin, these all have to do with breath, with air, with wind, with the movement of life, the animating principle in life, the soul that breathes through all of life. And when the ancient Greek, classical philosopher Plotinus was, who influenced Hillman so much, as you know, the founder of Neoplatonism. And Plotinus was discussing once in the Aeneids how it is that the movements of the planets in the heavens and the stars, how can these signify meanings that human beings can find significant, can read, can interpret? And when he says, how can this be? He says, it's not because the planets cause things to happen here in a linear, mechanistic way. Rather, he says these words: the stars are like letters which inscribe themselves at every moment in the sky. Everything in the world is full of signs. All events are coordinated. All things depend on each other. As has been said, everything breathes together. I think that's very profound. Everything breathes together. And I think of the powerful dramas of our time, how that all point to how we are breathing together. All the human beings in the world breathing in and out that carries the COVID pandemic and makes it a global condition around the world, or the young Black men in the United States with white policemen kneeling on them, and the Black men saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe," and or the destruction of the Brazilian tropical rainforests, which are rightly called the lungs of the earth, and that these produce so much of the oxygen in the world that we all depend on. We all need to live, and everything breathes together. And I think the evolution of depth psychology over the past century has been gradually opening modern consciousness to recognizing how deeply we are all interconnected, how we all participate in the soul of life that breathes through each of us in unique ways, in very individual ways, and yet that ultimately reflect the fact that we are participating in a larger whole. We are all part of that larger being. And not only the being that is all humanity, like a collective unconscious in a human sense, but really it's the entire Earth community. And indeed, I think the archetypal cosmos itself. You could say depth psychology has kind of, it reflects, I think, three important facets in relationship to history. On the one hand, you can see the emergence of depth psychology in the late 19th century through Freud and but also really even going back to Nietzsche and his great kind of descent into the deep psyche. You can see the emergence of depth psychology and a recognition of the power of an presence, dynamism of an unconscious dimension of psyche that is in the depths. You can see this as almost a necessary reaction, a necessary outgrowth to history, to the history of the modern mind, which had become more and more top-heavy with the Cartesian rational conscious self, conscious ego being the main focus. And suddenly depth psychology says, wait a minute, there's a lot more there. And the patients that were coming into the consulting rooms of Freud in Vienna and Jung in Zurich, many of whom were women, people like Sabina Spielrein or Toni Wolff, or the woman known as Anna O, who in certain ways invented depth psychology in her therapeutic work with Freud's teacher, Breuer. You could say depth psychology was born as a collaboration between men and women, psychiatrists in their white coats, but also the women and men who were whose soul suffering brought them to the consulting room, and they were in touch with something that was needing to be brought to articulation, brought to consciousness. And the doctors that they came to were the vessels that these messages needed to be carried through. And by the way, Isa, am I going at a okay pace for you? And okay, great, thank you. And so depth psychology is almost like a natural, organic, necessary compensation to the one-sidedness of the Western intellectual, spiritual tradition and scientific up until the late 19th century. And then there's a kind of bursting through of what had been repressed, a kind of return of the repressed, as Freud called it. But in other ways, you could say that depth psychology was completely an outgrowth of that tradition too, because depth psychology was, in a way, it's a perfect combination of the Enlightenment, European rational scientific Enlightenment tradition on the one hand, and the romantic, poetic, imaginative part of the Western tradition that particularly became strong in the late 18th century and through the 19th century. And depth psychology, both with Freud and even more with Jung, and certainly very strongly with all the post-Jungian depth psychologists and people like James Hillman, what you have there is a powerful synthesis, a marriage of the Enlightenment and Romanticism. You could say the sun and the moon, the solar Enlightenment and the lunar Romantic. And because depth psychology, on the one hand, is paying attention to the imagination, to powerful emotions and images and extraordinary states of consciousness and artistic experience and the poetic side of life, and also of pathology, of madness, of the far reaches of human consciousness. And all these concerns of the romantic part of the modern mind were brought together with the Enlightenment, rational, scientific perspective of how can we understand this? How can we illuminate it? How can we help with it? How can we help deal with people who are suffering and help them with their suffering? But do this through systematic kind of rational research and rigorous intellectual analysis. So you can see how they bring it together. But the lunar side, the moon side of the Luna side of the polarity, is in certain ways correcting the one-sidedness of the solar rational enlightenment. You could say when the sun shines in the sky during the daytime, you see only one light. All the rest of the sky is the night sky. All the stars are blocked out. All the other lights are blocked out. There's just that one powerful sun that shines its light with great clarity all during the day. But we have not just a day consciousness, but we have a night consciousness. The ruler of the night is the moon. And the moon has when the moon shines, you can still see many other lights, all the other stars. You can see many other truths. There is more of a connection to mystery, to also the interplay of light and darkness, of light and shadow. Excuse me. So I think that's one reason why depth psychology, and those of you who are psychologists, Jungian analysts, and so forth, you're carrying a very special gift, a remedy for our troubled souls and for our obscured modern mind that needs to be open to the larger mystery of life. Because depth psychology is really, we have to, not only do we need to bring North and South together and East and West, we also need to bring together the mind and the soul of the West. And you could say the modern mind is loyal to the Enlightenment, and the modern soul has a resonance with Romanticism. And Jung was right there bringing those two together in a constant interplay. Now, we all know now, since Jung's Red Book was published finally 12 years ago, we have a better sense for what he had been telling us about in earlier years during his life, about the great descent into the unconscious, into the deep psyche that he went through between about 1913 and 1918. And roughly, it was for several years there, right in the period during the First World War. And Jung's descent into the underworld was extremely challenging for him. But as he said, everything that he had to give the world later came from that time. All the powerful images and what he called the prima materia of his life work was impelled into his consciousness during that time. And as a result, he was able to bring certain gifts back to us, kind of a classic heroic journey to the underworld, the descent into the underworld, going through a dying to his old identity, a collapse of his old certainties, a fragmentation of his psyche before things came together in a new way. And that rebirth allowed him to come back into the world with certain boons or treasures, gifts for the rest of us to receive. One of these was his realization that psychology. He brought to psychology the recognition that we are all on a spiritual journey. That each life, the journey of a life from birth to death, is a spiritual journey. It is spiritually meaningful. It's not just about building up a strong executive ego. It's not just about adjustment to the demands of society. It's not just about success. It's a spiritual journey. And then he also recognized that a second gift, which is that every one of our individual journeys is embedded in a larger collective journey, a collective psyche, the archetypal unconscious, the archetypal psyche, the collective psyche, which not only is our individual psyches embedded in this collective psyche, not only that, but that collective psyche is on a journey too. We are participating in a larger, evolving historical journey that now the entire planet is swept up in. It's more clear today than ever before how much all of humanity and indeed the entire Earth are going through an evolutionary transformation. And he also recognized that informing our individual psyche, the collective psyche, and the journeys that we are all on individually and together, that informing this are great archetypal powers, principles, and that these archetypes can be understood. They were the gods and goddesses of the ancient imagination. They are also, and by the way, when I say gods and goddesses were the personified expression of the gods, of the archetypes in the ancient imagination, I'm not saying that therefore they're just unreal, imagined, as if it's a subjective fantasy, a construct of the human brain. The imagination is a tool, a means for act. It's a via regia, a royal road to be able to access deeper realities. We can't just understand everything in the world through our senses and through our rational analysis. The imagination gives us access to these deeper realities. And for many people, gods and goddesses are very real. I've experienced them myself. They're quite potent, ontologically vivid, I would say. So Jung brought all these very powerful gifts to us, which I think we're all continuing to take in. I want to say now, because I know James Hillman plays a major role in the life of your community there, that he's been an important influence in your lives for many of you, and also for me too. And I thought I would share with you the tribute that I gave at the memorial for his, after his death. James Hillman's wife, Margot McLean, asked me if I could give a short tribute to James Hillman that summarized in 4 minutes his cultural legacy in 4 minutes. And but I was one of maybe after me, there were many other speakers, maybe 20, 25 others at this memorial gathering in New York City. And each person, no matter how famous they were, like there was, famous musician or famous actress, psychologist, et cetera, but each of us had just 4 minutes. And so, but Margot wanted me to somehow begin by begin the memorial by articulating as well as I could what James meant for the cultural life of our time. So I'm going to just read this with so that Isa can. I'll try to read it at a pace that Isa can translate. James Hillman brought the very word soul back to psychology. He brought psychology out of the consulting room into the world, and he brought astonishing inventiveness, style, and learning to every sentence that he wrote and spoke. I want to recall here just one particular moment where James said something that perfectly captures his inner spirit. So here was the scene, the setup. It was the turn of the millennium, and James gave 2 major lectures in Santa Barbara in consecutive years. One was in 1999, and the other one was in 2000. So he had something to say on each side of what we called here Y2K. I don't know if you use that phrase, Y2K. It meant the year 2000. And you can remember that so back to my tribute. In the 1999 lecture at Pacifica, he spoke about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. And he pointed out that our calendar has built into it the apocalyptic fantasy with its 1,000-year sequence just then about to reach its threshold. Many of you will recall that at that time, at the end of that year, the end of 1999, as the century and the millennium went through its big shift, all the computer specialists and the planners were trying to avoid the global crash of the infrastructure, computers, et cetera, that were going to stop all the airplanes from flying, and computers weren't going to work, and civilization would grind to a halt. And it was just an anticipation of a great apocalyptic disaster. But then what happened is that as midnight, December 31st, turned smoothly into 12:01 a.m. On January 1st, 2000, and happy celebrations and fireworks took place around the world, and there was no collapse of civilization. So when the next year, James Hillman in 2000, September, he began his keynote address at the Psychology at the Threshold conference that I mentioned earlier. And he reflected on this fact that we had managed to avoid the catastrophe, that all the engineers and computer specialists had done their work and we had avoided catastrophe. And then he said, can we not snatch some defeat from this victory? And that perfectly captures James, how supremely James that remark. Can we not snatch some defeat from this victory? The marvelous trickster wit, the casual subversiveness, the counterintuitive reversal of the expected truism. In those two little sentences, straddling Y2K, talking about the apocalyptic fantasy that's built into our calendar, and on the other hand, talking about can we not snatch some defeat from this technological victory? James managed to hit about a half dozen of his favorite targets simultaneously. The inflated heroic ego, modernity, literalist apocalyptic Christianity, American can-do optimism, the techno-scientific managerial mindset. All this he did with his trademark view from below, his eye for shadow, the gift of the loss, the downside, the depression, the failure, the errancy. Above all, his love of turning upside down the common wisdom and snatching defeat from the jaws of victory on behalf of soul, on behalf of life. Now, one reason that James compelled and delighted so many of us was that he kept out contextualizing the dominant worldviews of both science and religion. Do you know what I mean by out contextualizing, Isa? Out contextualizing? Okay. He out contextualized the dominant worldviews of both science and religion. And he did this by virtue of his sheer learning, his erudition, his psychological complexity, and his spirited irony. He laughed at the dominant bullies. The list of dangerous two-horned topics to which he turned his extraordinary vision is nearly endless. Ecology, aging, war, destiny, puer and senex, the city and urban design, architecture, economics, the men's movement, racism, pornography, language, philosophy, Shakespeare, astrology, phenomenology, public education, art, animals, emotion, Shakespeare, the Renaissance, Romanticism, Neoplatonism. He contained so many paradoxes. James was wonderfully European, cultured, multilingual, in touch with the primary sources of the grand tradition. But he did what he did also as a born American, a jazzy, irreverent rebel, always improvising, overthrowing the dogma of the old monarchy, vigorously asserting the common life of soul, asserting the ambiguous many over the literal one. James was both very postmodern and very ancient. He saw through endlessly like a deconstructionist, but he also saw vividly the gods, the spirits, the depths, like an ancient poet. He recognized essences without ever succumbing to essentialism. He had an allegiance to the fallen world, yet he risked a large vision. He was a poet of psyche and a psychologist of the polis. Above all, James championed the imagination in its high rightful place at the center of human reality, with perhaps greater force and eloquence than anyone since William Blake. And he saw the anima mundi, the soul of the world, in ways no one had seen before, inspiring not only psychologists, but scholars across the disciplines, artists, poets, activists on many fronts. But he did not like system. He said, you cannot diagram a single thing I have written. He said, give me the pearls, but not the string. It's a noose. In a way, James worked alone within his own inner crucible. And yet he was always profoundly part of a larger community of friends and colleagues around the world, whom he helped in countless ways and was in turn stimulated by them. How deeply James enriched us with his unending flow of insights, placing so many things in a new light and and in shadow as well. His depth of soul and his breadth of knowledge, his sparkling language, his heretic originality, his sharp-edged individuality. He will be deeply missed, but he left us with so much that we will be integrating for a long, long time to come. So that's my tribute to James. Maybe I'll just, I want to open up in just a moment from my remarks here. I want to open up to having a dialogue with all of you in a discussion. Maybe I'll just say a couple of let me see, with my remaining time, I'm trying to decide, maybe I could ask your help, Marcus, on this one, and Luciana. Would you like me to, I could, with the next 5 minutes, I could say something about the comparing Hillman to Jung and differences between them. I could also just give you a short, a few minutes about my own journey with respect to archetypal psychology and depth psychology. So I don't want to take more time. So whichever one would be more interesting to you, I would do. Marcus, do you want to tell me which you prefer? For some reason, I'm not hearing anything.
Eu acho que você poderia falar mais 10 minutos, pouco de cada uma das suas opções. Tanto das diferenças quanto...
Oh, 5 minutes on each?
Fica à vontade, completamente à vontade, Rick.
Okay, thank you. So a little bit about first the similarities between Hillman and Jung. You know, by the way, Hillman was born when Jung was 50 years old, exactly half a century, and he died exactly 50 years after Jung died, 1961, 2011. Both of them are mavericks, or what we call in English mavericks. Both of them, of course, are focused on soul, on archetypes, and on the imagination, but with very, very different sensibilities. I'm just giving a few headlines here. Obviously, one could rightly give a 30-week course on comparing Jung and Hillman, but just within 5 minutes, I'll just say a few headlines. The very different sensibilities. On the one hand, Swiss versus American. Also, and US American, I should say. There's Brazilian American, which is a different cup of tea. And also you have Christian versus Jewish. More specifically, Jung is a kind of visionary, esoteric Christian, and Hillman is a visionary, secular Jew. Jung, also they had an interesting relationship to dualities or polarities. Jung likes to recognize or constellate hard dualities like masculine and feminine, or conscious and unconscious, etc., and then move to a higher unity or a deeper unity. Hillman likes to recognize or constellate hard dualities like spirit versus soul, or monotheism versus polytheism. But he doesn't like to move to a higher unity. He moves from that to a wider multiplicity. In a way, Hillman's commitment is very much to the plural, the multiple, the fragmented, the many, while Jung has in mind a kind of telos, a teleological movement towards a sacred marriage, a hieros gamos of the opposites. He wants to hold the tension of opposites, and then he experiences within the crucifixion of that tension of opposites the possibility of a new life. Something moves in the divine beyond our human ability to control it, and brings forth something new, a birth out of this crucifixion of the tension of opposites. Hillman wants to stay with the tension of opposites, because every time you assert one thing, there's something else that's being hidden that we need to bring up. And by doing that, he helps us move towards the polytheistic amplitude, richness of the depths of ensouled life. I think of Jung as carrying he had a kind of interior access to the spiritual lineage of European culture through Judaism and Christianity. Even as he was rebelling against and revisioning this lineage, but he was doing it from within. If you read something like Jung's Answer to Job, that very powerful essay that he wrote in 1951, it's basically a prophetic work within the biblical tradition, and he was on fire when he was writing it. He said, "This is the only thing I ever wrote that I would not change one word, because I was in a kind of fever heat of inspiration, that it just spoke through me, and I had no choice but to write it this way." And it carries a certain prophetic power, but it's very much a work from within the biblical tradition, even as he is revisioning it very powerfully. I mean, he essentially puts God on the therapeutic couch and says, let's analyze what's going on here with your omnipotent fantasies and so forth. And then on the other hand, Hillman was more on the outside of both Judaism and Christianity, even though his grandfather was a famous rabbi in the United States, a maverick rabbi, very unorthodox, very liberal, but he was Hillman himself was much more of a modernist. He had more of a secular modernism in him that took the utterances of religious traditions, of spiritual and psychological expressions, and saw them all as something to be reflected on. But he was very skeptical about taking anything literally. And as a result of having that kind of outsider status, his tendency to oppose spirit to soul as an absolute duality. Much of the time he would oppose these. Also monotheism to polytheism, or height to depth. This allowed Hillman to see realities and articulate them in ways that no one ever had. So I feel that James brings depth psychology more deeply into the postmodern descent. The postmodern descent. The commitment to multiplicity, to the fragmented, to not knowing, uncertainty, the as if, the seeing through, the focus on the shadow, the embrace of the fallen world, the skepticism about any spiritual redemption, his skepticism about any too easy mystical resolution of the opposites, his opposition to the classical Jungian focus on the self, on individualism, or rather on individuation. Though a side note, I just would say, in Hillman's book, The Soul's Code, the daimon has a bit of the self archetype in it. And there is something about individuation that is at work in The Soul's Code, perhaps more than James always endorsed in other books. Above all, he had a lot of, I think, his commitment to recognizing how the continued presence of the theologically rooted monotheistic heroic ego in its modern inflated form, wreaking havoc on the world and on the soul with its destructive, inhibiting influence on the soul and on the imagination. In all these ways, I feel like Hillman played a necessary role in helping us bring depth psychology deeper into the descent that the postmodern era, I believe, is serving for us. And this really brings up my sense of what the postmodern is about. I don't see the postmodern as just being deconstruction. It's not just skepticism. It's not just fragmentation. It's not just the shallow interplay of multiple memes and cultural themes and so forth. The postmodern, it is all that, but it's more. It's the postmodern I see as an initiatory crucible of transformation. It's like the collective psyche of European, American, Western humanity, and in some sense now carrying all of humanity into a kind of underworld encounter with planetary mortality, with the shadow of the human impact on the Earth community. Also dealing with the confusion about what's true, what's truth, what's reality, our epistemological crisis, the psychological crisis of falling apart, the feeling of at times looking at the world and feeling like a kind of insanity has taken over a particular population. Decisions being made that are just insane, like corporations that want to make more money in the next quarterly report for their corporation's profit at the expense of their own grandchildren's future. It's insane. And so there's this kind of encounter with the insanity that is also very much part of our postmodern time, very much like Jung's descent into the unconscious in when he was young, or in his 40s, when he was facing a feeling of going insane. He was feeling an encounter with a dying to his old identity, a dying of his old self, a tremendous disorientation, an influx of powerful unconscious impulses and imagery, and so forth. All these are signs of an initiatory transformation. This is just what happens in rites of passage, death, rebirth rituals. And it's as if our whole world is going through it now, and humanity is. And I think our postmodern era can better be recognized as a crucible of a vessel of transformation that is not dissimilar to what can happen in a spiritual emergency or a near-death experience, or the kind of psychological crisis that brings someone in to see a therapist, a dark night of the soul, and so forth. And I think the great gift that depth psychologists, like many of yourselves, have to bring to the world is this awareness of the gift that can come from the deep descent into our shadow, into our unconscious, into our suffering, and a letting go of our old identity. And out of that underworld journey can emerge a new mode of being that is not visible now, that doesn't come into being until a dying has taken place. And if there are enough people who have a sense for what this journey is about, and who have been able to contact themselves through their own journey, that they have found access to the deeper archetypal forces and meanings of life and death and rebirth, we can bring a kind of psychological and spiritual equilibrium, a kind of helpful stability to our world and the communities that we're part of as we go through the very powerful transformation that our Earth is going through. So I think I'm going to stop at this point and open up to your questions, your comments, dialogue with you. At another time, I can talk about my own journey. It's less important, I think, than to talk about these, whatever you want to talk about.
Obrigado, Rick, pelo seu depoimento. Muitas ideias, se abriu para muitos lugares interessantes. Vamos abrir então para as perguntas, seguindo o nosso protocolo. As pessoas colocam o nome nas listas e eu chamo e as pessoas fazem a pergunta. Rick, queria pegar um gancho para você poder falar do seu percurso também. Numa entrevista do Hillman, em 2010, quando ele foi no último congresso da IAP, em Montreal. Foi o último congresso que o Hillman participou, depois de muitos anos de ausência. E ele diz o seguinte, ele diz que ele sempre fez parte dessa grande árvore, que é a teoria junguiana. E que ele não consegue se ver, como muito é dito, como alguém que trabalhou contra Jung ou se separando do Jung. Mas ele fala que nessa árvore interessava ele alguns galhos, alquimia, imaginação, e não outros, como aion, como sincronicidade. A partir disso, eu te pergunto, quais são os galhos que você escolheu ou que você gosta mais dentro do pensamento do Hillman e mesmo do pensamento junguiano? Quais são os seus galhos preferidos?
Well, you know, I'm glad that you brought up James's or Hillman's consideration near the end of his life of his relationship to Jung, because sometimes he could, well, as he put it in Revisioning Psychology, he said, I follow Jung in his psychology, but not in his theology. And suddenly he's making a distinction there. And then because I think he particularly found himself in tension with certain classical Jungians in the next generation after Jung, people like Edinger and von Franz, with their kind of classical focus on the self, on individuation. It was too Christian for him, and at times one could think that he was negating a large part of Jung. But back a few years before 2010, I think it might have been around, I'm not sure, it would have been maybe 15, 20 years ago, he gave a weekend seminar on what was most valuable in Jung. And it was very clear all the ways in which Jung and he were, where he saw Jung in some ways he was like a son to Jung, or a little younger than that, more like a grandson. And with his own mind and spirit and soul, but he very much carried the Jungian focus on depth, on the archetypes, on the shadow, that would be a whole nother lecture sometime, where I took very good notes of that talk or it was a whole weekend seminar that Hillman did on Jung, and it would be fun to share that with you sometime. For myself, I came to archetypes first through starting in my youth. I heard a lecture in my Jesuit high school where the lecture was on Plato and Aristotle and their different views of the archetypal ideas or forms, the universals for Aristotle, and how those went on to influence Augustine from Plato and Thomas Aquinas from Aristotle. And it made perfect sense to me. And I really could see how you could see life in the archetypal way that Plato was describing. I saw life that way myself. When I went to back then I was reading Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, and their great novels were about they were able to somehow express these great archetypal themes in their work. What it is to be old, what it is to be young, what it is to fall in love. Or the brothers Karamazov. Each of the brothers carries a different archetypal mode of being: the mystical, devotional Alyosha, or the skeptical, existentialist rebel Ivan, or the instinctually driven Dmitri, etc. So I could see, like, great works of art are archetypal. You see it with, if you go to a film, as I did when I was 17, I saw Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal. The Seventh Seal is so archetypal. It's just completely Saturn, Kronos, death, embodied right there in the whole encounter. So I could really see the archetypes. And then when I went to, around the same time, I read for the first time some Freud. The introduction to Freud just completely made sense. Ego, id, superego to me. But then when I went to Harvard and I started reading Jung, and that opened up a richer sense of the archetypes. Joseph Campbell was a teacher and a friend at Esalen for many years. And he used to say at the beginning of his lectures, sometimes he would say, Freud was fishing while he was sitting on a whale. He didn't know what he was on. And Jung, in many ways, opened up that bigger revelation. Not only the whale, but really the whole ocean. And then when I went to Esalen Institute, I went to study with Stanislav Grof, and who's a psychedelic therapist, the leading LSD researcher and psychiatrist in the world, and for many decades. And psychedelic experience was very much opening up direct, intense encounter with the archetypal psyche. It's not just a concept. I mean, it's just as vividly real as you and I are speaking with each other today, or even more real, perhaps, after we leave the computer and interact with the concrete world around. I mean, the world of life around us. Hillman played a huge role in my life. He was both a teacher and a friend, an early editor for me, first publisher. He taught me, when I first read Revisioning Psychology in the 1970s, and also an early essay he wrote called On Senex Consciousness. It's about Saturn, Kronos, the Senex, written in 1970. You can now get it in the collected works of Hillman in the Puer and Senex volume. And that essay, his cultural learning, his fluidity in going, in bringing together different categories of being and seeing the singular archetypal essence that was breathing through each of these. It was, and the fact that he, particularly in Revisioning Psychology, was rooting, grounding the whole depth psychology revelation that he was carrying forward. He was grounding it in the longer tradition of Romanticism, going back to Ficino, the Renaissance Neoplatonists and humanism, and all the way back to the ancient Greeks, Plato, Heraclitus, Plotinus, etc. Hillman gave me, it was a kind of liberation because he gave me a model for how I could write about my insights in a way that, I would never write just like James. He's one of a kind. Nobody can write like him. He is, Hillman is, probably our best writer, certainly in English, of any psychologist since William James. But still, even though I would never write just like Hillman, but still he gave me a model for how to write in a way that drew on my education, my cultural learning, and I could depend on an audience out there that I didn't have to explain everything to. And because Hillman expects you as a reader to get it, you have to kind of keep up with him. And I appreciated that about his style. So he affected me in those ways. He inspired me with his ability to write insightfully about archetypes, and his willingness to stand up to the mainstream literalist, reductionist modern mind, and to be able to speak with a kind of inner authority and humor and wittiness about a perspective that contextualized what they were saying and talked about it as being, well, that's the scientific fantasy, or that's the rationalist fantasy, but it's not the way things are. That was a great liberation for me. So those are a few words.
Obrigado, Rick. Vamos abrir para as perguntas, então. Primeira pergunta da Neuza. Neuza, por favor.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Hi, Rick. Neuza. How are you?
Hi. Good to hear your voice.
It's nice to see you with us in our community with your great background sharing. And I loved your, how you say, tribute to Memorial to Hillman. Was more than a tribute. I felt like was a love letter to him.
Oh, thank you.
Touch my heart.
Thank you.
Eu vou falar em português porque é uma das coisas que as pessoas... É o jeito que a gente dialoga aqui.
Of course.
E a minha questão é, quando você disse, né, que a humanidade está passando por um momento de transformação profunda. Certo? E eu fico aqui pensando, eu gostaria que você falasse um pouquinho quais seriam os arquétipos que estariam envolvidos nessa transformação que está sendo pedida por essa inconsciente coletivo, né? Que não é mais... Porque não é mais uma subjetividade individual, mas é uma coisa mais, vamos dizer, planetária, ou como você gosta de falar, do cosmos, né? You know?
Yes. Yeah, in some ways, thank you, Neusa. I might just mention that yeah, Neusa and I first met must have been what 1980 in at Esalen Institute in California. So and then you, Neusa, came with a group of friends to Santa Barbara as well, and a few years ago, and attended some conferences there. So what you're bringing up is very much what my work tends to focus on, which is how, as important as each of our individual journeys is to us, we're all participating in something much bigger, and more than at any time in our lives, I think we can see how we are part of a very dramatic historical turning point that is coming to a kind of critical climax, which I think will really require all of us to be bringing our everything we've ever learned, all our deep inner work, our psychological work on ourselves, our self-exploration, our willingness to confront ourselves, and to be able to, in some way, come into a new relationship to the larger Earth community, by which I mean not just other nations, other ways of life, other human beings, but also all the other forms of life on this planet, and the oceans, and the state of the biosphere, because the tendency in modern humanity, in fact, as they say in English, modern man, very patriarchal, masculine framing of the human experiment, that the tendency is to put man and Homo sapiens up at the top of the pyramid, and everything else is below, and a particular type of human being is at the top too, tended to be white, tended to be, European or European American, tended to be male very often, or and with a certain mindset too. And all these, that pyramid is collapsing right now, and that's a kind of spiritual crisis, as well as a very pragmatic one. I mean, obviously there's a medical pandemic crisis, epidemiological crisis. There's an ecological climate crisis. The extinction of species. There's a spiritual crisis in the world. There's a crisis of can we have any grounds for hope in the future? All these have come into question in a way that has not happened before. If I think you know this, Neusa, but perhaps not everybody in this group here today is aware, but I have, in my work that came out of working within the Jungian tradition and working with Hillman, also working with the esoteric archetypal astrological traditions, and those practices and methods that I found very illuminating of the deeper archetypal astrology is extremely helpful in specifying or pinpointing which archetypes are more being activated right now, and in what relationship, and collectively, not just individually. And so I gave a couple of lectures in the last year for my graduate school public programs. One was called "What's Happening in the Stars Right Now," and the other one was "On the Planets in 2021." And each of those is a pretty substantial lecture. I have little helpful diagrams where you can see what I'm talking about graphically. But if I were to summarize just very briefly what I was saying in these, it's that the archetypal powers that are fully constellated right now, where the planets are right now, over these last 10, 15 years, and then coming to a critical turning point over the last 3 years or so, particularly involving the planets Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto, that in many ways we are, to summarize in a single sentence, I would say that there are volcanically intense pressures. Isa, you know, a volcano, like volcanically intense evolutionary pressures are being forced or exerted on all to bring about a radical reconfiguration of all life structures, and that we're being forced to confront this. You know, it's a kind of spiritual emergency, ecological emergency, medical emergency, political emergency. But as Stan Grof talked about, it's both an emergency, but you can have a spiritual emergency and an emergence, an emerging, a birth, a new mode of life. But it can only come out of the ashes of an old way of being. And I think to the extent that more people are willing to do the hard inner work to go through their own kind of ego death, their own deep transformation, that will help move this encounter with mortality into perhaps more of a near-death experience. And we know how near-death experiences can be, they're so transformative. I mean, nothing changes our, transforms us more morally and spiritually, more strongly than a near-death experience. If you suddenly think that you are going to die in the next week or a year from now, everything changes in your mind, and you think, what's really important now in my life? How am I going to live the most meaningful life in the time that I have left for me? And in certain ways, that's what we are today. That's what we are today being asked to do, is to reevaluate what's really important for us and reconfigure all our life structures. How do our corporations relate to the larger environment that they live in? How do our industrial ways of life relate to the larger interplay of species in this world? How can we break out of this delusion that human beings are the only conscious intelligence in the world? We are embodied. We live in an ensouled world in which intelligence and spirit and soul go all the way down in all forms of the material world and cosmos and earth, animals and plants and ocean and wind, and all that's ensouled, all that is breathing. And in a sense, the modern human being has been a kind of tyrant who has come to the end of its rope, and in this larger community. And we're waking up. We have to wake up to our participation in this larger community, a kind of spiritual democratization of all life, not only human beings, or not only certain members of the human species, but all of life is spiritually dignified. We have to wake up to that. I don't know. So those are a few words about what I see kind of archetypally happening right now.
Okay, thank you.
Obrigado, Rick. Obrigado, Neuza.
Obrigado, Marcos.
Thank you.
Wagner, tá por aí, Wagner?
Tô aqui. Tá me escutando?
Sim,
beleza?
sim.
Beleza. Obrigado pela proposta, pela palestra. Richard, gostei muito do seu trabalho, da sua explanação. E eu gostaria de fazer uma pequena consideração a uma fala que você colocou aqui. Eu coloco assim que o homem moderno, né, o homem contemporâneo, né, ele tem uma ânsia, né, de ausentamento de si muito grande, porque para ele o mundo parece que não tem sentido, né? E você menciona as plantas visionárias. Só que muitas vezes o uso dessas plantas visionárias parece que elas são usadas apenas para um uso analgésico, narcótico, né? Visando justamente se ausentar do mundo, né? Como se buscando uma outra realidade, né? Mas o Jung vai dizer que o primitivo, né, ainda está em nós, mas oculto, né? Então, como você falou, né, o homem contemporâneo está inconsciente das suas raízes ancestrais e espirituais e que conectavam, né, o homem primitivo à sua alma. E você menciona Hillman no sentido de que ele se opõe a uma resolução mística da tensão dos opostos. E, no entanto, né, o misticismo dos povos originários permitia a eles lidar com esses opostos. Não resolvê-los, mas lidar com esses opostos, né? Então, eu acredito que Jung vá nessa direção. Ele não propõe um misticismo redentor, mas sim um retorno ao espírito, à linguagem da alma e à consideração das imagens simbólicas do inconsciente. Aí a pergunta que eu faria, não estaria aí a atualidade da proposta de Jung para lidar com essa tensão dos opostos, Richard? Obrigado.
Thank you. I appreciate your point very much, and I think you could say that there are different types of mystical experiences, and it partly depends on how you define mysticism. But I think Hillman's opposition to the mystical transcendence, he was particularly focused on that type of mysticism that was negating this world, that was kind of up and out, that he saw as being an escape from soul, an escape from the human condition. And that was, in certain ways, you would say that this is a form of spirituality that Hillman was opposing. It's a form of spirituality that emerged during the axial era and is very strong in certain forms of Christianity, Buddhism, even Neoplatonism has some of that as well. I always felt that James Hillman, he loved Neoplatonism in Plotinus and others, but without the top level, without the nous, that was too up and out, too denying of the embodied soul that he wanted to stay true to. But the type of mysticism that is carried in, let's say, the primitive or primal indigenous traditions that are still deep within us all, and are carried in by shamans in ayahuasca rituals or peyote rituals here in North America, or mushroom psilocybin in Mexico, etc. Those are tapped into an earlier form of spirituality that was very close to nature and not leaving the body, but in touch with the body and in touch with the forest, the rainforest, with the animals, etc. And I think that's, I think people can take psychedelic or visionary plants for different reasons. Some do it maybe just to kind of to go to another world, yes, but not all people do that. Many people are taking, doing these journeys and are getting more in touch with their getting, I mean, many people come out of such experiences deeply committed ecologists, for example, deeply committed to trying to save the rest of the earth from the depredations of human exploitation. I noticed, yeah, here's a couple of people. Julia is saying here on the chat in English, she said, as Jung had in 1944 a near-death experience, and she adds, most of psychedelic experiences are like near-death experiences too. Yes, there is. I don't know if most of them are, but many psychedelic experiences are very much like what Jung went through in his Red Book period, and have their value. I think what you're talking about is a distinction between two different types of mystical transformation. One of them is revealing a transcendent world beyond this world, a higher realm of a higher realm of reality, of pure spirit, etc. But there's another form that has even deeper roots in human evolution, another form of kind of mystical opening, awakening that connects us to the fact that nature and spirit and the anima mundi are all interconnected in our own bodies, in our psyche, in the trees, and in the animals around us, and so forth, and in the embodied soul life of that comes through in our dreams, and so forth. And I think Hillman Hillman's a complicated guy. A lot of times he would put down, he said, I'm not going to go primitive, I'm not going to go transcendent, mystical, I'm not going to go Eastern. I'm going to be the Western imaginative tradition. That's my tradition. Okay. But at different times in his life, he pulled gifts and treasures that he saw coming from whether from India or from the tribal indigenous traditions and so forth. So it's hard to, Hillman is so mercurial, Hermes-like. He can't be pinned down to one position. But thank you for, I think you make a very good point about there's different ways of relating to the tension of opposites.
Agradeço, de verdade. Muito boa a explicação. Muito obrigado mesmo, de coração. Obrigado.
Obrigado, Wagner.
Thank you for your question. Thank you, Wagner.
Oi, Richard, muito obrigada. Você já meio que respondeu a minha pergunta, então eu vou te fazer uma pergunta mais sobre a sua experiência. Eu queria saber, que eu acho que é um pouco isso que o Wagner perguntou, o que seria, então, uma espiritualidade com alma, né? Já que o Hillman critica tanto a questão da espiritualidade, acho que você já respondeu bastante isso, mas eu queria ouvir a sua experiência além com o Groff, né? Eu sou uma fã do Groff e queria saber, hoje, depois de todo esse tempo passado, olhando para trás, se você vê essa experiência mais como espiritual ou mais no campo da alma, né? Pensando nessa questão de espírito e alma dentro da psicologia arquetípica. Obrigada.
Yes, thank you. Yes, you could say that the two sides of depth psychology, Hillman carrying the archetypal psychology and Groff carrying the transpersonal psychology, and both of them are very important to me. And my life fate or journey was to, in some ways, bring these together. And I often would, I ended up teaching many courses with Stan Groff, where I would be bringing in the archetypal perspective and in a close interplay with Stan Groff's work. And he found it very enriching, and it actually had an influence on the evolution of his thinking, so that in his most recent, Stan Groff just turned 90 years old this summer. I just finished editing an anthology of essays, what we call a Festschrift, in honor of someone, a senior scholar, in this case, Stan, who's 90, bringing essays together by many scholars, Houston Smith and Joseph Campbell and Fritjof Capra and Ralph Metzner and so forth, Francis Vaughan. And right at this time, Stan did an interview in which he talked about his own evolution to coming to recognize how the archetypal perspective, in his view, was the most, it gave the most insight for understanding the qualities of experience that people went through in their archetype, in their psychedelic experiences, holotropic experiences, any kind of extraordinary, non-ordinary state of consciousness. And he sees the archetypes as being kind of supraordinate over our experience and informing all our experiences from below or from above, and that they're the most helpful principles for understanding our powerful experience. So I think I see both of them, both Hillman and Groff, Jung and Freud, and also the many powerful feminist voices that have had a transformational effect on depth psychology. I think of Catherine Keller, or even going back to Lou Salome and Tony Wolfe and Emma Jung, but going right up to the more recent important voices that are opening up. I think, well, Mary Watkins, for example, has had a real influence on me in terms of opening up the understanding of a depth psychology that embraces the larger social justice issues of the world. All of these different streams seem to me very important. One way I'm different than James Hillman. Hillman liked to find something he really disagreed with, or a kind of opponent or an enemy that he could speak against, and then bring all his genius to doing that. And my style is a little different. My tendency is to want to become like, what is each person and what is each path telling me that I can find that's valuable to me, and to bring those into a creative dialogue that is a little more embracing and a little less confrontational. But Hillman's confrontational style was totally essential to his genius in certain ways. That just was who he was. But in he kind of changed in his later years. I think he became a little, I mean, he himself says he became kinder as he got older. I think good influence from Margot, his wife, for example. But I know that in earlier years, I once introduced him. I introduced Hillman to Stan Grof once at Esalen Institute. I'd invited Hillman to come and stay and just enjoy himself there for a while. At that time, I think Patricia Berry and came as well, and so did Mary Watkins and Ed Casey. They all came together. And but this one visit that Hillman came, Stan Grof was giving a lecture that night on at Esalen, and his lecture was on the ways in which Freud's psychoanalysis had been shaped by certain Newtonian metaphors that he took from Newton's physics. And Hillman really appreciated it. And he was very, very he liked that very much. But I know that Stan made him a little bit nervous, made him a little uncomfortable. Stan has a great deal. He's a little like Jung. He's a tall, large, man with a great deal of power and confidence, and he's speaking from huge levels of experience with a certain authority, and he's talking about things that are dear to Hillman too, like the nature of archetypes and of the gods and goddesses and so forth, and how do we relate to them. And I think James Hillman's attitude was, we need the archetype, we need to recognize the reality of the archetypes and how they give the deep meanings and richness to human experience. But we have to watch out for getting, we don't want to get possessed by them. We have to see through them and not get compelled by their particular fantasy of what's really going on. He saw them as being potentially very dangerous, which of course they are. He's quite right. But that kept James from being as willing to surrender himself to the spontaneous influx of a powerful, like psychedelic experience, for example, because not wanting to get swallowed up by it, as it were, and lose that crucial capacity to bring psychological reflection to whatever archetypal experiences shaping one's life. Groff, by contrast, Stan Groff felt that we need to surrender in special circumstances, contained therapeutic circumstances, like in an LSD session, or it could be a spiritual emergency, but where it's being held in a safe way by a therapist or by people who can be helpful in supporting a person through a deep dive into the throes of the unconscious. In a way, it's what Jung needed support through his deep descent, the Red Book period. And he got it from Tony Wolff. He got it really from his family too, from Emma, etc. All those helped stabilize him. And also Tony Wolff is giving him support in dealing with these unbelievable experiences he's having. And both Jung and Hillman, I think, they didn't want everybody to go through that kind of a potentially fragmenting, destabilizing experience that one could have a psychotic break out of. And Groff has this sense that if you are in a safe vessel and you're prepared for going through a deep dive into the powerful crucible of the psyche, and if you're supported, then you can surrender to and go beyond anything words can talk about. The body, the influx of repressed memories, things that are coming from other lifetimes, could be animal experiences. All sorts of things can flood in, and they want to come to consciousness and be released. Groff's, I would say, you could sum up all of Groff's work in one phrase. When I asked him, well, how do you deal with, this is the very first lecture I ever heard him give in 1974. I said to him, how do you deal with people who are going through what we used to call a bad trip, a bummer, a very scary, terrifying LSD session or psychedelic experience? How do you help with that? How do you deal with something like that? And he said, the full experience of a negative emotion is the funeral pyre of that emotion. When it comes to consciousness, the repressed energies that have been frozen in the body, frozen in the psyche, the trauma, and so forth, if it can be brought to consciousness and released, the fire of consciousness releases it into the out of the closed system of the body and soul, and can have a healing, a transformational effect, and you suddenly have a different perspective on the trauma, and even can recognize that it has helped give birth to a new mode of being that wasn't otherwise possible. So I've taken a little extra time to answer your question, because in a way, Grof and Hillman represent two polarities that exist in depth psychology. And in some ways, they represent two of the most, I think, creative and fruitful developments in depth psychology since Jung. There's others as well that are very important, like, as I say, the feminist, the eco-psychology, and so forth. But the Hillman-Grof archetypal transpersonal psychology dialogue is a very important one. And I find my own work is in some ways attempting to synthesize them.
Muito obrigada pela sua resposta.
Ieda, eu estava
conversando... Thank you, Ieda.
Obrigada.
Estava conversando com o Rick antes e eu havia perguntado a ele se Esalen existia mesmo ou se era um lugar mítico, daqueles lugares imaginários que Humberto Eco lista, né? E ele falou que não, existe na Califórnia, Big Sur é um lugar lindo. Então, Esalen é real, né?
Ele é real. É que nem Xanadu, né? Fica pensando naquelas coisas bem cringe, né? Tipo, Esalen.
Vamos lá.
Well, you can talk to Neusa about Esalen because she lived there for a while many years ago. But it is still a very, very beautiful place. It's not carrying quite the same energy because it's a different era now. Different people, etc. But you cannot walk onto that sacred ground. It was sacred to the Native Americans who lived there, and very powerful. And you cannot walk onto it without feeling its transformational power. And I think that's one of the reasons why Stan Grof and I found it so important a place for us, because so many people went there to undergo deep transformational experiences. They were wanting to address their own pain, and they were hoping to heal, or they were wanting to expand their consciousness through new ideas and so forth, as well as new experiences. So that helped create a milieu that in a morphic field, to use Sheldrake's term, that encouraged transformational experiences. So it was a great laboratory for us to be working in. And in a sense, all of nature in its magnificence, with the Pacific Ocean, the giant redwood trees, the waterfalls, the hot baths, the hot springs coming from the womb of the earth, the mountains, Santa Lucia Mountains, all these together created a kind of place where the archetypal dimension of reality was visible.
Bela imagem, bela descrição. Rick, última pergunta, com o nosso amigo Gustavo Beck. Gustavo, por favor.
Okay.
Hi, Max. Hey, Rick, how are you?
Hi, Gustavo.
Good to see you. I was thinking something else, but now that you were talking about Hillman and Grof, you kind of blew my mind open. I had never thought about it like that. And you made me think of something, because one of my issues with Hillman is how he always seems to be restraining himself. He's always kind of taking you to a certain edge. And when he gets to that edge, it's not exactly that he pulls back, but he doesn't allow you to go any further. So, and the one thing I would add is that when you were talking about Grof, the person I was thinking about is Lopez Pedraza, which is sort of a natural sort of, and he was also like this sort of big, powerful man that kind of, but anyway, I would just like to know your thoughts about, because my sense is that what was operating within Hillman was a very profound sort of Senex configuration. So like I think that Hillman had this very deep Senex sort of weight always within him. So if you could talk a little bit more about your experience with him and about how you, because when you mentioned his paper on Senex consciousness, which I think is perhaps the most relevant right now of Hillman, those two, the Senex consciousness and the negative Senex, like, what would you say is the value of the Senex archetype in Hillman's work? I guess that would be my question, because we don't tend to identify him with the Senex, I think.
Yeah, he championed the puer.
Yeah.
Because he saw the somebody like Marie-Louise von Franz. Marie-Louise von Franz would be championing the Senex really over the puer, and saying that the puer needs to grow up, and Hillman would bring up all the positive qualities of the puer that we need to take account of and not just write off. But you're quite right. I mean, he's quite a Senex figure himself. I mean, he was a judge. He was constantly judging, very much a Senex figure. Saturn is very strong in his birth chart. Those of you who are interested. Oh yeah, Saturn squaring his Neptune, squaring his Mars, squaring his Jupiter. But also, for those of you who are interested, it's trine his Mercury and trine his Uranus as well. He played a key role in my coming to terms with the puer. This is the puer and the Senex, and maybe this will help respond to your question. I had written an early version of Prometheus the Awakener, kind of my first monograph, and it kind of blossomed into this 300-page, or 280 pages. I was just on fire writing it, and and Hillman asked if he could publish it. But then as we were going, and I said, okay, and we signed the contract, and we were going through the editing of it. And he pointed out something that was very transformational for me. I mean, he said, on the one hand, you're writing at that time, because I was in this kind of state of almost like an archetypal possession state of a kind of Prometheus archetype, because I was writing about Prometheus. Any archetype you write about, it comes into it gets constellated. It becomes very present. And of course, I was just feeling it so strongly, and it was shaping how I was writing so much. It was coming out like a kind of Nietzschean, thus spoke Prometheus kind of prose. It had its insights and richness, but as I started seeing it, this all during my Saturn return, I was 30, he pointed out something to me. He said, Prometheus had to be chained because he didn't recognize the other gods. This was in some ways his way of judging, being on the Senex side. He was judging the Promethean puer who is going to liberate the world with his genius, you know, that kind of thing. And instead, he wanted to he wanted to bring that down to size. He wanted to bring that down to a more modest human size. And I found that a very, in some ways, that was a huge moment in my Senex puer development. And from then on, I mean, I then decided to write about all the archetypes in Cosmos and Psyche, not just Prometheus. And I also decided to build a more solid foundation through the honoring of the history of Western thought in The Passion of the Western Mind, which is a kind of, in a way, it's a kind of honoring of the Senex that is behind, you know, me. Mm-hmm. So, but at the same time, Hillman, I totally get what you're saying. He, you know, that quality that he has of bringing you up to a point and then stopping short, or being restraining himself, but also wanting to restrain you from, you know, putting up a limit, all that Senex Saturn function. I don't want to psychologize Hillman too much, because he is a richly complex human being who had a kind of genius of that was a vessel of more than him was coming through him. He was a vessel of a bigger cultural impulse. And I feel that his limitations were important to his genius. Mm-hmm. Certain, like geniuses sometimes need a certain blindness to some dimension of reality in order to see more clearly what they can see. And by his kind of opposing spirit to soul so intensely, and being, you know, and being so critical and judgmental about so many things. I mean, our California, even though he would come out here every year to teach at Pacifica or like to visit Esalen, but he memorably called the whole human potential movement the California Sunshine School of people frolicking in the ocean. Everything's good, moving towards wholeness and growth. Obviously, the great mother archetype is in control, etc. He could be so critical. I feel that Hilm, just as I wanted to bring this, I saw Hillman and Groff as being part of a larger whole. So spirit and soul are as well. It's not just a duality; it's a continuum. I don't want to psychologize James, but I will point out that you have in his biography, I don't know how many of you have read the first volume of the biography of James Hillman. Here it is, by Dick Russell. I'm not sure if I'm showing it here. Well, let's see. Okay, so Making of a Psychologist, it's pretty big. That's just the first volume. And one Jungian, John Beebe, called it the most, he felt it was the best biography in depth psychology ever written. It's very good. And in it, among other things, he describes some of the experiences that James had when he was young. Mm-hmm. And that in a way, he was getting experiences something like Jung in the Red Book. And then in some ways he pulled back. He restrained himself because, I mean, I don't want to say, again, I don't want to be the therapist. I'm not in that kind of a position. But my sense is that he pulled back from the abyss a bit. Mm-hmm. Even though the abyss can be so scary and can swallow us, can be very destructive. There's many people that's true of, but I do feel that depth psychology has evolved ideas, containers, practices, methods that can help us leap off of that cliff and go through that deep transformation that is so necessary that the world's going through right now. Because the more of us that are able to do that deep dive ourselves, the less likely we will be to have to bring an actual dying, an actual apocalypse. The more we can work it through psychologically, somatically, symbolically, spiritually, the less we have to do it literally. And I think in some ways that's a crucial turning point. But I don't want to be the judge of Hillman in this respect, because the very things that constrained him and that made him judgmental and negative and very Senex driven about things that I value, parts of my own being and aspirations that he could be judgmental of, because he was a judge and negated them and held himself back from exploring certain things. That allowed him to give us gifts that were not otherwise perhaps possible for him to have given us. And so I'm grateful to him for being just who he was.
And if I might respond real quickly, because again, hearing you clarify a lot to me, because I mean, I've written about Hillman a lot and I've criticized, but I think that the thing that I value the most, and it's not so much about him, I think it's in his work. It's that his work is really melancholic. And now that, and sort of that embodiment of this sort of smallness and this sort of awe and of the fear of the bigness, I think that's what I still value in Hillman, and that's what I think the Senex is, which is it really keeps you at bay. The work, I don't know what his life was about. I mean, he's a bit too far away from it, but there's something in his work which is always pointing towards our human limitation, which is really depressing. But I like, but at least that's what I like. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. That's what I know.
Yeah, and thank you, Gustavo, because that's right on. I really can agree with that. I value him for that too. The embrace of the melancholic, of the depression that is the flip side of the mania that drives the modern man and the U.S. American, et cetera. He was articulating a powerful compensation to that one-sidedness of our culture, of our civilization. And he went through such powerful experiences, working with, he was like, in his early 20s, and it's the end of World War II, and he's working with veterans that have been blinded, young men his own age, who have been blinded in combat, in war, and he's helping them navigate. It was part of his job. I think it was associated with the military. Part of his job was to help them just get their clothes together or go over where the food was or whatever his task was. It had a huge effect on him, the tragedy of the human condition. And it came in at a very early age. And I think there is a kind of underlying compassion, even though Hillman could be, he could be as sharp as and sometimes he could be mean when he was putting down somebody who asked him a dumb question at the end of one of his lectures. He could make a person feel very small, but he did such a great job of, I think he was carrying a certain compassion for the human condition that includes the condition of being mortal, of living with tragedy, of being not able to fully redeem oneself from all the complexes and traumas that one has inherited in one's life. And in doing that, this is part of what I was trying to get at before, is that he helps us all enter more deeply into a postmodern embrace of the fallen world, which we need to if we are to go through, I think, the underworld journey that of transformation that I truly believe we're going through. So, well, thank you for bringing that up, Gustavo. I can very much relate to what you said. Well, I think we probably have gone way past our limits here in what we were planning on time. I'm grateful that so many of you stayed with us all through this long conversation. Marcus, I'll turn it over to you.
Tá bom. Eu respeitei o princípio da associação livre. Vamos deixando as palavras aparecerem. Rick, queria te agradecer pela tua disponibilidade. O Tiaços, né, no meu nome, no nome da Luciana Ximenes, no nome da Isa, ele é um herdeiro, né, ele possui intimamente uma relação com a psicologia arquetípica do Hillman. Nós tivemos aqui Patrícia Berry, Ed Casey, Mary Watkins, Stanton Marlan. Então, não havia como não convidar você, Rick, para estar conosco e também dar o seu depoimento, trazer sua experiência, suas memórias pessoais junto ao Hillman. Para nós é um imenso orgulho, um imenso prazer te receber. Espero que possa ser a primeira de outras tantas possibilidades de nós estarmos juntos. Queria te agradecer e deixar contigo as últimas palavras.
Well, I just, I'm very grateful to you for the invitation. I really am honored by this time together. I've been pulling back from doing so many lectures and teaching and so forth, getting to that age. I'm 71 now, where I'm needing to kind of focus on the work that I need to get done before I go to the next stage of things. And yet the opportunity to be able to speak with you all in Brazil is very precious to me. And I was truly grateful and honored by your invitation. It was a very gracious invitation when you wrote to me. And I feel blessed to see all of you, number of friends that I know from years in the past, and I do look forward to more in the future, and perhaps someday I come and visit.
Será prazer te receber. Muito obrigado, Rick.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much.
Até a próxima, Rick. Muito obrigado. Pessoal, obrigado pela presença, pela participação.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye, Marcus. Bye, Luciana. And thank you, Isa, for wonderful translation.
Agradeço a presença de vocês, mais um Teaços, bastante especial, talvez o mais longo até agora. E já deixo o convite para o dia 20.
Bye.
Nenhum problema.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
Dia 27 de agosto, a gente vai receber a Angélica Lowe, analista junguiana alemã, que vai apresentar o trabalho do Erich Neumann sobre Eros e Psique. O convite já fica feito. Muito obrigado pela presença, um abraço, bom final de semana a todos. Obrigado, Luísa. Tudo bem aí? Beijo, querida. Tchau. Gustavo Beck, abraço.